call the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise to speak on this motion, which attacks the Abbott government's reform package for higher education and, as is typical of this Labor opposition, strong on complaint but no plan of their own. By contrast, the Abbott government does have a plan, and the fundamental problem with this motion is threefold. Firstly, that the government's higher education reforms strengthen the system and create more opportunities for students. Secondly, this package is consistent with core principles of fairness, that if you get substantial private value from a university degree, you should bear a fair share of the cost of providing that degree. And thirdly, this motion makes no mention of the key equity safeguards which are built into the package but which are ignored in Labor's dishonest scare campaign. These reforms, Madam Speaker, strengthen the system and create more opportunities for students. Thanks to these reforms, there will be an additional 80,000 Commonwealth-supported places by 2018, 35,000 bachelor degree places and 48,000 places for diploma, advanced diploma and associate degree students. There's an expansion of funding beyond the current players in the system to any registered higher education institution, including TAFEs, private colleges and universities. These reforms, Madam Speaker, allow a stronger university system in Australia. They allow Australian universities to maintain and over time improve their global ratings, which of course serves the interests of Australian students and gives more of them a globally recognised credential. And don't just take my word for it, Madam Deputy Speaker. What is it that the Vice-Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University, Professor Greg Craven, had to say? Quotes, "There are three good reasons universities must be able to set their own fees. Otherwise, we cannot fund vital national research, the international perception of Australian higher education will decline, and students will get an education that is admittedly cheap but increasingly nasty." Close quotes. These are the things that Professor Greg Craven says will happen if this Abbott government reform package does not go through. Professor Sandra Harding of James Cook University quotes, "We should not underestimate the size of these reforms or the need or urgency for these reforms. The status quo isn't an option." Close quotes. Now, Madam Speaker, these reforms maintain and continue the reform direction laid down by the Bradley Review of Higher Education in 2008. Now, that review recommended opening up universities to everybody with the desire and the requisite ability to attend. Now, the previous Labor government did half the job. They deregulated the number of places, but they rejected the Bradley recommendation that base funding per student going into the system should increase. And so we have an outcome where the number of places has increased, but at the same time the previous Labor government cut funding. And isn't this an absolutely classic Labor approach? Great rhetoric, worthy goals, but no performance, no delivery, no plan as to how to make these outcomes actually materialise. As Belinda Robinson of Universities Australia said just today in the Australian Financial Review, quotes, "It is simply not possible to maintain the standards that students expect or the international reputation that Australia's university system enjoys without full fee deregulation." So, Madam Speaker, the reforms contained in the package which the Abbott government is putting forward, which Education Minister Christopher Pyne is leading, are reforms designed to strengthen the university system and in turn create more opportunities for Australian students. Now, the second point, Madam Deputy Speaker, which goes to the fallacy of this motion, is that the policy approach the Abbott government is pursuing is consistent with a core principle of fairness, that if you get substantial private value from a university degree, it's only fair that you bear some of the cost. And again, don't just take my word for it. Former Labor Prime Minister Paul Keating in 1995 quotes, "There is no such thing, of course, as free education. Somebody has to pay." Close quotes. Or the current Shadow Treasurer in his widely read book Hearts and Minds in 2013 quotes, The Hawke government also introduced the Higher Education Contribution Scheme as a way of raising more revenue to finance the extension of the number of university places. I supported it because I could see the inherent logic. Our incomes would be high because we had been to university." Close quotes. Or indeed the former Prime Minister Bob Hawke, interviewed in Collective Wisdom in 1998 about the HECS system. Quote, "I don't have any problem with the concept of fees. One of the greatest stupidities was the proposition that the Whitlam Labor government introduced of, quotes, free education." Close quotes. Or, of course, the man whose thoughts we turn to so often in this chamber, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer Andrew Leigh, who had this to say, quotes, "Government alone cannot provide all the additional funding necessary for our universities to become top-notch. More money is required from all sources, including students." And so, Madam Speaker, it is consistent with these basic principles of fairness articulated by a series of Labor thinkers who I have quoted in this debate today, which underpins the logic of the approach the Abbott government is taking in its reforms in higher education to shift the proportion of the cost of a university degree which is met by the student taking the degree from today's 40% on average to 50% on average. But the third point I want to make, Madam Speaker, in the time available today, is that we have had a disgraceful scare campaign, a dishonest scare campaign from the Labor Party about the likely outcomes in the education marketplace as universities go about setting their fees once they are given the freedom to do so. A disgraceful scare campaign which ignores many of the facts and the opinions of key participants in the sector. What did the Vice-Chancellor of La Trobe University have to say in the Financial Review on the 15th of September? Quotes, "If given their freedom, universities can be trusted to be sensible on how they will price courses. The best way to ensure moderate fee increases is to not set a ceiling on prices." Close quotes. And indeed, much of the commentary which we see, the overblown commentary, the dire threats of the kind of fee levels we might expect, seem to ignore the operation of a competitive market and the fact that Australian universities will be subject to competitive disciplines. It will not be feasible for them to set prices which are higher than students will be willing to pay and higher than their competitors charge, and of course not just domestic competitors but international competitors, online competitors and so on. Now, one of the other disgraceful misrepresentations which is commonly made in this debate by the Labor Party is that there's going in some way to be a removal of the HECS scheme. In fact, on the contrary, there will continue to be no upfront fees. Students will continue to have available to them the HECS scheme, now known as HELP, under which they can, rather than being required to pay up front, they can accumulate a debt and pay that over time, and of course it's income contingent. You are not required to pay $1 until such time as you reach the threshold, presently slightly over $50,000 a year. What we also fail to hear from the Labor Party about is all of the other equity measures contained in this comprehensive package. Measures for low-income students, those from a disadvantaged background, the proposed new Commonwealth Scholarship Scheme, which will benefit thousands of students from a disadvantaged background. Indeed, universities will be required to spend $1 in 5 of additional revenue on scholarships for disadvantaged students, or indeed the elements to improve equity for regional students and regional campuses, with a regional loading of $274 million over 4 years. The support which is extended to private universities and non-university higher education providers, many of which have a very good record of getting non-traditional students into tertiary education. And again, I quote Greg Craven of Australian Catholic University, quotes, "Pine has moved decisively to protect students entering lowly paid but socially vital professions. The cuts to nurses and teachers, for example, will be noticeably less, recognising their relatively limited earning opportunities." Close quotes. Madam Speaker, It is vital that there be reforms made to the higher education system to make it stronger and to give more opportunities for students. The Coalition has a plan to do that. Labor has no plan, it just has the usual whinging.